thank you very much, everybody, for joining us tonight on this beautiful first day of the Easter break. It's great to feel the city coming back to life. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we create, work and meet on tonight, the Boonwurrung and the Wurundjeri people, two of the major groups of the Greater Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their ancestors, elders, past, present and emerging. Now, tonight's conversation is not only our last talk for the season, but it's also the end of a series of conversations that have really considered the future of our city after the year that we've just had, after the pandemic experience. And for MPavilion, it's been a really unusual, for all of us it's been a really unusual year, but for MPavilion we would normally build a commissioned pavilion in the gardens opposite the National Gallery, and that just wasn't possible last year. But we also knew that it was essential that we came back with our program. We had a real sense that we need to urgently reconnect with the creatives that we work with and with the audiences that we work with. And we went into the season in November with a scalable model, if you like, where we pop up at our permanent locations, where each pavilion that we've given to the community has got a permanent home. And we went back to each one of those locations and we did our events to camera in chairs that kept you 1.5 metres apart and no audiences, and we just got going. And we went to different locations and things were looking good. Then over the first few weeks, we found that it was very hard to get the capacity to achieve the level of activity that we wanted to. And as we connected with the people that we collaborate with, there were so many ideas and so many collaborations and so many connections happening. So I went and spoke with Rob Adams, city architect, and asked him whether, in amongst all the challenges the city faces, is there a space that's become available that is unexpectedly available that would be an appropriate location to talk about what's happened to the city and what comes next? To talk about what we're talking about tonight, how do we reimagine the city? Instantly, Rob pointed to this location, and we always try to find our design story. This location is the first multi-storey car park in Melbourne, designed by Peter McIntyre, one of Australia's most significant architects. So, bingo, that's great. And it's a building where the top 2 floors were offices, then they were turned into more car parking space, and then in this underutilised moment where there was no cars or people in the city, we turned it into a cultural space. So it feels like the perfect place, looking out into the trees and across the rooftops, to have the conversation tonight about how we reimagine our city. So I'm going to ask now Andrew to introduce the panel and moderate the conversation, but thank you very much for coming tonight. Thank you.
So Sam has been standing, so I'm going to stand too. Makes me feel happier to stand. So as he mentioned, this is a second in the series of panel discussions, Adapting the City, thinking about the future of the city. When we talked, Sam and I, about who we should have speak and how we should structure it, there was a couple of very clear distinctions between how you approach the city. Last talk, we had a series of people talking about the working city, talking about how working habits have changed, how assumptions about how we work has changed. We had an architect, we had a workplace advisor, we had an actual working young person to talk about their views on the future of the city. But it was very much focused on work. But of course, everything has changed in the city in the last month. The city depends on work, of course. It also depends on education of students. It also depends on culture and on community. And all of these things have been under some stress in the last 12 months and possibly for some time into the future. However, as we know, whenever we have a moment of disruption, we also have a moment to think again. We have a moment to maybe reconceive of some of the things, the way we approach building and developing the city. We know that around the world there are very different types of cities. There's radial hub and spoke cities, there's linear cities, cities of high density, cities of less high density. And there are different triggers what makes the city work in different ways. We have seen over the years Melbourne change considerably. Last week, Jill Garner gave a very nice appraisal of how over 3 decades so much has changed and become very rich in the city. But at the same time, as she said, there's a bit of a worry as to how much of that can we hold on to all of that. Are some of those things at risk right now? And so we have this moment where we all love Melbourne. I think that's why we're here tonight. But we are also slightly worried about where it might go in the next 12 months or the next 10 years. So tonight we have 4 speakers who are going to talk about the city as a place of culture and as a place of economics and the wider ramifications for how we build urban environments. We have Rob Adams, who many of you will know from the City of Melbourne, who has been involved in the changes in the city, in the CBD, or maybe the Central Activity District for a long, long time. We have Martine Letts from the City of Melbourne, who an organisation which brings together the business community, the academic community, and there's a third book. What is it? The business, academic, and the community, exactly. But it's a place of bringing together concerns and considerations and opportunities for the city. We have Tanya Davidge from UPLA. She's an architect. Many of you will know that she was involved significantly in the Federation Square debate some time ago, but is heavily involved and interested in public realm and how the city can serve the public. And we have Marcus Spuller from SGS Economics and Planning. And what SGS does and has done for many years is look at economics from the perspective of urbanity and things that affect the city specifically. So we have quite a range of speakers. The structure for this evening is quite simple. Each will speak for 45 minutes and bring up 2 or 3 key things that they think are relevant and urgently important for us to think about. This is about future forecasting. What do we need to be aware of? What do we need to think about at this moment, looking forward? So we'll have 4 or 5 minutes for each of the speakers. I'll conduct a bit of a conversation for about 20 minutes after that and then open it to questions. And I figured that because this is just before the long weekend and it is a lovely evening, the fact that you are here means you're pretty committed, and therefore I'd like to know your thoughts and I'd like to have your questions when we get to that. So without any further ado, and I hope each of you can speak loudly because the skateboarding, which is a part of the vibrancy of the city, is quite loud. Nevertheless, we want to be heard. And I'd like to start. Rob Adams, could you kick things off? 4 or 5 minutes or even 6 minutes. Your thoughts around the city.
I think Marcus was anticipating the start there, but let's change plan. That's fine. Look, I think when Sam phoned me and said, would you come and talk about adapting the city, it's my home turf. I've seemed to have spent a career adapting things. I've lived with my lovely wife in 14 different houses over my career, and we've never lived in a new house. We've always, even if we've rented it, we've adapted in some way to live in. And coming to Melbourne back in 1983, there was this proposition that the city needed to be adapted. There are a few things that I've learned from that 38 years experience, and that is you can adapt a city, but there are 2 things you need to know. You need to know what you're adapting the city to, and if you know what you're going to adapt it to, well, then you need to know that it's going to take you a long time because it's going to be an incremental thing with a whole lot of actions. There's not one single gesture that will adapt a city. Some people might point to Bilbao and say the Guggenheim did, but in fact there was more behind that than just the Guggenheim. And cities of the size of Melbourne will require multiple actions to adapt them. So if we sit here today and say, what is the future vision of the city? Well, if COVID has been something that has stopped us all in our tracks, the next thing that's going to stop us is climate change. And I think, in a way, we started to get a glimpse of that at the turn of the century, particularly in Melbourne, when we got what was called the 11-year drought or the Millennium Drought, which was, in fact, the onset of climate change. So we need to think about what city will both accommodate events like the one we're having at the moment, but will also be sustainable into the future. And I think there's quite a simple answer to that, and it's an answer that I saw back in my university days when universities were growing back in the mid-60s. And the one university I was at was Cape Town University, and they couldn't expand. They were surrounded by a national park. And when I came back from travelling around Europe and looking at all the universities, I went to the planners there and I said, so what are you doing? And they said, oh, we've asked a different question. The question we've asked is how well are we using the stuff we've got? And over 40 years, they've trebled the student population and they haven't built much. They just re-timetabled. And I think the big challenge for us in all the capital cities of Australia is how do we stop growing out and how do we re-timetable and come back on ourselves? And I think that's the big challenge, because if we do, and we've done the study, you can do it and save yourself $110 billion for every million people you locate within the existing boundary of the city. You don't have to build the infrastructure, you just make it more efficient. And I think that gives us not only an environmental reason, an economic reason for doing it, there's an environmental reason. You're closer together, you're well connected, and what COVID has taught us is we can actually work remotely. So maybe we don't all have to come in at one stage or all at the same time. So I look forward to the adaptation of a city that will be both environmentally sustainable, economically viable, and socially cohesive. Because the other thing that came out of COVID was we started to meet each other in our local area. And a small story I'll tell you is we went into a local little deli called the Rose Street Pantry near the Rose Street Market in Fitzroy. And there was some fantastic bread, and I commented on the bread, and the lady behind me said, oh, I make the bread. And her name's Martine. And I said, oh, Martine, it's fantastic. And she said, do you want me to deliver it? I said, I'd love you to deliver it. She said, when do you want it delivered? I said, well, I'd like one loaf on a Wednesday and one loaf on a Friday. And she said, all right, just look on your door, I'll knock and I'll leave it on the door. There, on a Wednesday and a Friday, is this lovely loaf of homemade bread wrapped in brown paper with, the old twine, and a little message from her, and sometimes the bread's decorated. And I think we all had those experiences. We rediscovered the intimacy of our local area. And I think the opportunity is to make all of those local areas as good as we want to make the central city.
Thank you very much. You do have a mic, I think, just there, just right next to you there. Thank you very much. Next up, Marcus, can you give us your views?
Sure. So if we take ourselves back to January 1993, office vacancy rates here in central Melbourne were over 26%. That compares with 11% this last January. So the early 90s recession hit Melbourne very hard, worsened by some local disasters, financial and fiscal, including the collapse of the Pyramid Building Society that some of you might remember. Now, the adjustment of asset values, an adjustment in rents, an adjustment in landlord expectations sparked some remarkable shifts in our city. We rediscovered the laneways, and they went from being no-go areas to being absolutely symbolic of what this city stands for. And all of a sudden it became possible for people to live in the city again, something which we hadn't seen at that time for 100 years. So Melbourne came back bigger and better and stronger after that major crisis. The current crisis that we're facing doesn't have the same structural attributes that early 1990s recession had. Rather, it's the outworking, as we all know, of governments deliberately shutting down the economy for health reasons, which is perfectly warranted. Now, some structural trends that were in train prior to the pandemic were accentuated by COVID. In particular, the working from home, or the living at work, as Gideon Hay calls it, trend. Now, this is causing problems for the CBD in the short term, but I believe in the longer term, or in the medium term, it will create more space in the city for those creative, technology-based and otherwise innovative firms that can really benefit from the collaborative environment that only the CBD can offer. So I'm confident that Melbourne will come back bigger and better over the next couple of years following this crisis. The greater challenge, in my view, is that we build a stronger community than the one we had leading into the pandemic. Between 2009 and 2019, developers in the City of Melbourne added 39,000 dwellings, and 3.3 million square metres of office floor space or employment floor space. Overall, I estimate that they pulled out about $12 billion worth of profit over that period. Now, in my book, they deserved every cent. They took on risks, they dealt with a mystifyingly complex planning system, and they delivered the urban fabric that the city needed to undertake its amazing transformation. Meanwhile, the people who sold them the land for these buildings took no risks, they added no value, they simply profited from the uplift in their land value made possible by the community's investment in infrastructure and the community's maintenance of the planning system, which deliberately rations access to development rights for a better city. Were only half of that uplift to have been gained, and they pulled out $6 billion, were only half of that to have been captured for community investment, the annual revenue would have been equivalent to the total annual operating budget of the City of Melbourne. Now, many factors lie behind the fractured and unequal society that we have today, but our failure to share the benefits of Melbourne's past and prospective boom, as capitalised into land values, has not helped. In 2009, social housing in the City of Melbourne comprised around 8% of the total housing stock in the city. By 2019, this proportion had halved. This is emblematic of the unfair distribution of Melbourne's much acclaimed 3-decade-long period of prosperity. We can't afford to snap back to business as usual on this front as Melbourne regains momentum. As well as investing in social housing, we should apply a reasonable share of the uplift in land values in central Melbourne to a bigger and better public realm and to the creation of civic and cultural institutions that all Melburnians and indeed all Victorians can embrace.
Wow, that's a hell of a prospect. You should go into politics, maybe, Marcus. I'd like to ask Martine Letts to be the next speaker tonight.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and good evening, everybody. Wonderful to see you all here tonight on the eve of Easter. I'm reminded, I was just talking to a couple of the colleagues this evening, and I was remembering what we did a year ago, and at the Committee for Melbourne, just like many other organisations, we had been working from home for about a week. We were facing, frankly, an existential crisis because we were a membership organisation that was reliant on discretionary expenditure, and we thought that we'd be the first to go west when people were inevitably tightening their budgets because they could see the economic difficulties that were coming out of lockdown, out of an extended lockdown. And in fact, the first thing I did was to say to the staff, you will be stood down for 4 days in the Easter week to help us prepare our bottom line. And they also all took a pay cut, and they all took a 20% pay cut, and they also took some leave so that we could survive and keep our little team intact. And I'm very happy to say that we managed to do that, but it was very much in that spirit of collaboration and in the best interests of the organisation and the team of Melbourne. It was infused with that spirit, and there's a great community spirit in Melbourne still that has stood the test of even these most testing times. I'd also like to go back to history for a moment. Committee for Melbourne was established in 1985 when the beginning of the crisis that Marcus described really came to a head in the early 90s had commenced. Melbourne was losing people hand over fist, retail was dying, we were really in a decline, and this was the moment when a group of proud Melburnians from the private sector got together to say, this is terrible, we want to help, we want to actually provide some input in a very non-controversial, non-political way, work with government, how can we help? And that was the moment that the committee was born, and in many ways that spirit of our origins was revived again during this period, which arguably has been the worst period that Melbourne has faced since the 80s and early 90s. So So we were very pleased that many of our members actually did stay with us. We probably lost about 20%, but we did keep many on board and a lot of proud Melburnians. And I'd like to acknowledge in particular tonight Naomi Milgram, because she is a proud Melburnian. We were very pleased to give her the Melbourne Achiever Award for the contribution that she's made for Melbourne and continues to make through these kinds of things like the MPavilion and the contribution of the foundation, bringing us all together to continue to work and collaborate. So thank you very much for your contribution. It's much appreciated, and we're very proud of proud Melburnians like that. And our reason for being has always been pretty forward-looking. We want to shape the best possible future for our city. So we're not tactical day-to-day. All of our members obviously have an interest, but for them it's the love of our city and wanting the best for our city that drives them. And I'm talking not just about the CBD, but Greater Melbourne and how Melbourne interacts with the rest of Victoria and the world. So we've always supported creative, bold ideas to ensure that the city can be the best that it can be. And it has always involved, and this has become a bit of a cliche, but it's worth repeating, it is about collaboration. And it's about collaboration between the private sector, the public sector, and people, fueled by ambition and big ideas. And we don't have a shortage of talent and big ideas now. What we do lack, and that the committee has really been keen to point out, is we still work in silos. We've still got government agencies doing what they obviously must do, which is to contribute and come up with ideas for big projects that will continue to employ people and that will get us out of this recovery. But this is not a bottomless pit. And the sooner we start developing far more collaboration between the public sector and the private sector, particularly, and the knowledge sector, of course, particularly on what we believe to be the economy of the future, what will sustain us, is innovation, the knowledge economy. And this is where Melbourne, unfortunately, has taken a particularly big hit because of the fact that not only have our interstate borders been brought up, but even more importantly, our international borders are closed. I don't know whether you realise that Australia is probably one of the few countries in the world that does not allow its citizens to leave without a permit. Now think about that. That's actually, that's the sort of thing that you see in North Korea and in the former Soviet Union. Good health reasons for it, but it's an interesting thing to think about, how we kind of walk back away from that when the time comes when we really want to open up our borders. We have been very strong advocates now. We have had a tremendous health response. We are the envy of the world. We do say that we now have reliable quarantine and tracking and tracing, so this is the time to really open up again and to supplement the talent and the knowledge and the skills that we've got, to use our great reputation and desirability to bring back international students, to resuscitate, in particular, our international education sector. Our newsletter of this week actually emphasises that, because this is going to be the source of our great progress and wealth and our income as we go forward, and we need to prepare. Despite the fact that the UK and the US and Canada and others have big COVID emergencies now, they're taking more students, more talent in order to be there to prepare for the rebuild. So we really have to be strategic about this and think for the mid to longer term. So that's one of the main messages that we as a Committee for Melbourne are trying to say. Be prepared, make sure that you attract the best skills, the best talent, the best input, so that we can create Melbourne as continue to be one of the great global cities, one of the great cities that is known for innovation, collaboration, and for leading the world and bringing us out of this. One of the things that we've learned from COVID is that cities need to be prepared to shock-proof themselves and sustain themselves at times of crisis. And again, that only evolves that only works if we collaborate between the health sectors, between the economic sectors, with the drivers of the economy. So we really do need to think about developing a far more integrated plan. We need integrated plans for transport as well as housing. If we're looking at a different settlement plan for the CBD, as Marcus has talked about, we can't do this in silos. We actually need to work with government, work with the agencies, with the creative sector, to make sure that we can develop a plan that is innovative, sustainable, and longer term. So our message from the committee is, and if you look at the way we are composed, we're a cross-sectoral committee. Our entire DNA is based on the notion that the best results for complex problems
comes from talking to people who are not within your usual sphere of reference, to get good assessment of the plans that are being put forward, but also to build good ideas and to build collaboration and community engagement and commitment to whatever results that you come up with. So whether it be redesigning the CBD to take account of a hybrid working environment, by the way, it's a living experiment right now. None of us really know, if we put our hands on our hearts, whether this working from home is going to last forever or whether it's just something that we're doing for the moment, for the next couple of years, or whether we're all come flocking back to our cities. But one of the things that we have had a problem with in Melbourne and in all Australian cities is that we're growing too quickly, we're growing unsustainably. Use this moment to develop a plan where you can decentralise, strengthen the CBD, strengthen the suburbs, build greater connectivity between them through better technology, through better connectivity, build collaboration, build regions, activate regions between our capital cities to build Australia's economy of the future where Melbourne can make a major contribution. So these are some of the ideas that we've been putting forward. The Eastern Seaboard Collaboration was something that we actually did with Marcus's organisation, where we envisioned an Australia that was connected, where all the big cities were connected, where we activated the regions in between through better transport connectivity, digital connectivity, right down to far smaller projects. And I've been trying to get Rob to activate this one, which is how do we actually use public spaces in the CBD, which are privately owned, get the owners involved in helping us green the CBD so that this could be a healthier and more attractive place to come back to work in. So we've got the big ideas, we've got the little ideas, and we've got the membership to do it. So we're really excited about some of the ideas that are coming out of our membership to build a more sustainable and better future for Melbourne.
Super, thank you very much. Wonderful. And our last speaker tonight, Tanya Davidge. 5 minutes from you, please.
Great. So I'm going to start with a confession. My confession is I'm not from Melbourne. However, I've chosen to live here because I truly love Melbourne and I'm incredibly passionate about it. So when I was thinking about this talk tonight, I was thinking, well, what is it that makes me love Melbourne? Why do I love Melbourne? Why am I here? And when I lived overseas for a while and I thought, I'm going to move home, and I did the thing that a lot of people in that position do. They go, okay, Sydney or Melbourne, Sydney or Melbourne. And I kind of thought, Sydney, conventionally pretty. Sorry, Stephen. Classically beautiful. But Melbourne has character and Melbourne has personality, and I'll take personality over classical beauty any day. And for me, this thing I love about Melbourne, this personality, is embodied in the fine grain of the city. And I think it's really important that we think about the fine grain of the city at this moment in time. We can see the fine grain of the city in its architecture, the details on the facades at Fed Square, our small-scale heritage buildings, the details on our large-scale heritage buildings, and these wonderful little details that we find, such as the water wall at the NGV. We can find this fine grain and small-scale character in the urban realm. The different character and nature of Melbourne's many precincts and neighbourhoods, all compelling in their own different ways, the scale of our laneways, the materiality of our cities, and the commitment that Melbourne has to developing a city for people. So, its commitment to developing Melbourne as an urban forest, as a place for pedestrians and cyclists and for users of public transport. And I would also argue that the fine grain of our city, the personality of our city, is also found in its community and its commitment to culture. So here you can eat food from all over the world. It's not possible everywhere. You can find art and performance in the most unexpected of places, and you can see where the community comes together to create wonderful places at a large scale in places like Fed Square or at the State Library, or sometimes in our streets in protest, and at the small scale in places like Guildford Lane. And this fine grain is caught in a bit of a tension between the big and the small, and in the kind of in what the city can value, what we can value, and what is intangible, what are the kind of intangible social values, because the city is a dynamic system. It's a place for community and it's a place to live, but it's also a place for making money and a place to make a living. And these two things are not in opposition but in tension. Sometimes I think you can't have one without the other. But it's important we think about this tension as we move forward. So pre-COVID, there were things that were impacting the small scale and the fine grain of the city. Things like a rise in regulation where the risk was shifted from players who could best kind of take it to smaller businesses and community who had the least capacity to afford it. What we were also seeing is the consolidation of urban form through the globalisation of real estate, which is packaged up into financial instruments and doesn't look at apartments as homes, but as in kind of investments, global investments at that case. And we know that that works on urban form in certain ways. It kind of conglomerates smaller packages of land and creates very large developments, and often these developments are big and bland and don't have the spatial complexity, not all of them, but some of them, don't have the spatial complexity that a fine grain requires to kind of to live and to open up. And then I think COVID hit, and we can see that COVID is going to have a potentially huge impact on the fine grain of the city if we don't think about how to mitigate it. We know that in times of crisis, the small go under and the big consolidate. We've seen how inequity has exacerbated issues and how the marginalised have been hit the hardest, as Marcus was talking about before. And we're seeing social isolation, and isn't it wonderful to be back here chatting to each other now? But we're also seeing, I think, if we're talking about the CBD, we're also talking about urban isolation, as we've seen that the CBD has been isolated from its workers and its visitors, and hopefully that is starting to come back now. It feels much more lively out there. So when we think about a post-COVID environment, I really believe deeply that we need to think hard about the small scale and the fine grain, because the small scale and the fine grain is what connects community to place. It builds place attachment, a sense of belonging, and it creates the neighbourhoods and the places that we love. And it's why people want to live in Melbourne and visit Melbourne. What's really interesting to me is I've been watching really closely what's been happening with hospitality and the experiments that we've kind of been making with parklets and outdoor dining. A lot of these are fantastic. They're also enclosing the beach down in my area, so I think I can draw the line there. But in a lot of ways, the hospitality has been a really positive thing. We're looking at councils being kind of nimble and creative, and what I'd really like us to think about moving forward is how we can do that to foster place and a sense of community, and also our arts and the kind of creative sector. I think there's some really fantastic opportunities ahead of us, and we need to think about when we're rethinking the city, we need to think about who we're making the city for. And I think drawing in community is a really important phase that we need to go through next.
Super, thank you very much. Wow. So we've assembled quite a few different thoughts, possibilities, and future visions there. I think to kind of, I guess, to bring some of these things together, some of these strands together, there are kind of two key territories that are being staked out here. One is a kind of a time-based temporal idea about long-term versus short-term, and how we actually manage to activate a long-term vision. So one is a kind of a temporal vision, and certainly cities do have different kind of dynamic ecosystems that are based on different temporal kind of qualities, different metabolisms, you might say. And the other is a spatial and scale issue around the small and the large. A lot of you have talked today about the large and the small, and I'm reminded, in fact, that after this event, there's a movie with David Giannotto from OMA, which of course made famous the small, medium, large, extra large as a cipher for understanding very important aspects of urban design. So those are the kind of two very big kind of umbrellas I'd like to kind of like catch a few questions under, starting with time. Rob, as you mentioned, you don't change a city overnight. You don't change it in 3 years or 5 years. You change it in decades or generations. At the same time, there are other kind of metabolisms, and one might be a kind of return on investment kind of calculation, which when I was young, I used to, my dumb reading of these things. 7 years, if you get your money back in 7 years, is probably a good thing. So that's one kind of way of looking at it. And then there's those, of course, there's the quarterly returns. That's another temporal frame. And then there's, of course, the political temporal frame of 3 years or 4 years. So you've got these different kind of cycles, and they are not necessarily aligned. So I guess my starting question is, if we want to think about the long term, and we need to try and head towards long-term solutions, we recognize we can't do anything in the short term. How do we approach these different timeframes, the quarterly report, the 7-year return on investment, the 3-year political say? How do we approach those as if to say, yeah, that doesn't work in a city? We have to be able to think long-term. So what are the kind of what are the low-hanging fruits here around how to bring some kind of common understanding, marshal different time frames so that we're actually not thinking about the next 3 months or 3 years, but actually the next 30 years? Maybe Marcus, could I start with you on that?
Well, at planning school, they kind of teach you about long-term strategy and short-term tactics. And the kind of trade-offs that you're talking about, I think, aren't as compelling as they might seem at first sight. So long as you have a clear long-term vision, I think Martine was talking about this, you can organise your tactics in the short term in a pragmatic way to work. I think what we've been lacking really for the last, dare I say it, 35 years or thereabouts, ever since we lost the Metropolitan Planning Authority, we've lost a clear and compelling and continuing metropolitan vision. And so short-termism has tended to take over, pragmatism has tended to take over. And so we've tried to make do with short-term interventions. And I think overall it's kind of worked. We've muddled through, but I think we've now exhausted the capital that we built up in our post-war planning period. Yep. And we need to reinvest in long-term planning, and we need to do it in a without the silos. And I have grave doubts, I must say, whether the way in which urban management is organised in Victoria, whether we're in a position to do so.
Okay, thank you. Well, you've upset a few things here, because I had a nice little arc of about 3 or 4 questions, and I was going to seamlessly bring together the temporal with the spatial with this question of the greater metropolitan region, because this is where they come together, because when you have big authorities, they have to think long term. Now, Martine, the other night in a separate conversation, you mentioned this question around the possibility of a Greater Melbourne Commission, somewhat similar to the Greater Sydney Commission. Do you want to unpack your thinking on that a little?
Yes. So as Marcus mentioned, we used to have, was it called the Melbourne Board of Works, Public Works. The 2 biggest authorities with the greatest pull in Melbourne at the time were the State Electricity Commission and the Melbourne Board of Works. But they essentially laid out the plan that we, and correct me if I'm wrong, that we are living with today. And it's worked quite well. But this is not what an evolving city like ours, a fast-growing city like ours, needs. Quick interposition. Australian Bureau of Statistics released a report the other day that for the first time since the 1930s, the gap between Melbourne and Sydney's population is almost zero. So there are 205,000 less citizens in Melbourne than in Sydney. And so we are clearly, and we've lost something like 20,000 or 40,000 to the regions. So the exodus hasn't been as large as we expected or thought, at least not so far. So we need to plan for growth, and we need to make this city a much better and better connected and more equitable city, not just for the CBD, but also for the western regions, which there's a lot of building going out there. It's the fastest growing part of Melbourne, but there's absolutely nothing serious to connect them via public transport in the other way. So this is a crisis. I mean, in some ways we might say that we have survived, or we have got into the post-COVID environment almost too quickly. The shock to the system has not been really serious enough to shake us out of our lethargy and to say we cannot continue just to do a little bit here and a little bit there and not have some kind of grander plan that will build a thriving and livable city for the future. There's a lot of patching going on. You know, you've got Plan Melbourne Refresh, and you've got the other plans there, and you've got Infrastructure Victoria talking about sweating existing assets, but they're not talking to one another, and they're not developing an integrated plan. So we are condemned at the moment, sort of piecemeal approach to all of this, when this crisis should have focused our minds and said, we really need to do this. Now, Sydney had a different problem. Sydney has 3 urban centres. And Sydney now has a 3 cities plan. By the way, it now has a Visit New South Wales plan, which is based on its 3 cities plan. So their tourism agenda is up and running again. They're ahead of us. They're starting to steal the march. So we do need that joined up thinking, and a Greater Melbourne Commission would be one way of doing it. Now, and with appropriate community consultation, it wouldn't be a benevolent dictator the way Gavin Jennings used to try, the former Minister of State used to describe it, but maybe we do need a little bit of benevolent dictatorship to get us going. One final point. Common approaches. The not invented here syndrome in Australia is alive and well. Everyone's got their own little contact tracing system. Everyone's got their own little app. There is Federation University, invented here in Melbourne and completely ignored by federal authorities and by state authorities. It's a fantastic tracking and tracing system. People don't even need a phone. So people my parents' age, they can just get a card, they go to Australia Post, they register their details, and you can use it everywhere. You can use it in retail, on public transport, or around all of Australia. You could bring down the borders and keep everyone tracked. But no, we all have to invent our own little approaches to this. It's depressing.
I think we can all share your frustration on that particular point, for sure. Rob, depending on which city you look at, sometimes you can see that central cities can sometimes be somewhat cannibalistic on the wider kind of metropolitan area, to the extent that their success is often at the failure of what's around it. I know that you have a very different view. So what do you think, what agency can the City of Melbourne have, in a kind of an ironic way, you might say, to actually enable the success of other smaller areas around Melbourne that need the support of something as big and as important as the City of Melbourne?
Well, one of the reasons I didn't talk specifically about the city, because I mean, back in 1985, the city had a vision, and it was a very simple one. It was that we wanted a 24-hour city that looked and felt like Melbourne. And that's held true for almost 38 years. And that's why, in many ways, the city has adapted. And, you know, you talk about the temporal. You know, we talked about getting the balance back between the motor car and people. You know, more people, fewer motor cars. We started in South Yarra and Mason Street and widened a footpath by 1.5 metres and planted 10 trees. Today, we're closing half of South Bank Boulevard. You know, we're doing it on a scale. We've actually taken over 80 hectares of asphalt out of the central city and turned it over to open space.
80 hectares?
80 hectares. So, but it's an incremental thing. I mean, if you didn't actually record those, and we have recorded them, people wouldn't notice it. It's like warming up the bath. So I think what central Melbourne can show all the activities centres, and I don't want a 3 cities metropolitan area. I want a 50 cities metropolitan area. I want every activity centre to be a place that has a decent density, has mixed use, is well connected, has a high quality public realm, but has its local character. And I think, you know, what Melbourne can think, and I feel a bit as talking out of school here, because I should be arguing that we should all rush back to the centre. But I feel that, you know, that's just playing with the heart. We've got to think of the whole body. And Marcus is right, we need someone to look at the whole body, not just to look at the different organs. And so we need something like the Metropolitan Planning Authority. And if we did just one thing, if I could be a dictator just for 5 seconds.
Do it.
Just stop expanding. No more greenfields. You know, I don't want to see another photograph of 3 kids and a mum and dad going across the hillside into poverty.
Yeah.
Because by the time they've actually paid $8,000 for the taxes on the roads to get in, the 2 cars they have to own, frustrated and got into family violence and the rest of it, that is the vision we're selling at the moment, and it is dumb. It is really dumb.
Yeah. Tanya, I wanted to ask you about, still on the question of scale, but at the smaller scale. You mentioned how the city marshaled very quickly a changing attitude to hospitality so that they could quickly get things on the street, quickly get things rolling. In a sense, bringing some kind of like management of regulation for that. You also mentioned that cities depend on the creative blood that goes through its veins. Taking kind of Rob's lead here, if you were a queen or dictator or whatever the determining factor would be, if you were able to make a single change to enable the city to become more welcoming and accessible to the creative industries and creative economy, what would you do? This is your chance, your one thing.
Oh my God. I think what's really interesting working in the creative industries and trying to work in the public realm is, and also trying to work from a community base as opposed to a business base often, or a more grassroots base, is that there's a lot of risk that you have to assume. So every time you hold an event, every time you kind of build something in the public realm, every time you want to put a dining chair on the sidewalk, there's a lot of insurance that you require. And sometimes I wonder whether it's right for us to be placing all the risk on the people that can least afford it, or the small scale, when we can think about taking risk in different ways. Like, where does the insurance lie when you give an artist a grant? Maybe the insurance should lie with the council, and the artist should actually be kind of facilitated more easily into creating things. So I think, you know, the way we've thought about hospitality actually asks really interesting questions for the way we can think more nimbly. You know, we've seen, I suppose, with the contact tracing inquiry, what shifting risk does. And so maybe we need to think about where we place risk and who takes the risk to allow kind of more community events to happen. I mean, it's hard to even just close a street to have a street party, you know, in your local community. So how do we foster these things in ways that really give the streets over to the people, or the public spaces over to the people in the community?
That's a really good point. And it's interesting because sometimes you think to unlock a great creative solution, you need something really complex. But maybe, for instance, insurance might be a good place to start.
Yep.
In the same way, in the whole bringing the laneways to life, maybe just the small liquor license laws was enough, and actually nothing else was needed.
Well, a really interesting thing, a friend of mine is one of the women who started the greening of Guildford Lane. And she didn't realise it at first, but she was having these conversations with council. She started by putting some pots out in the lane and planting some stuff in them. Then finally she had a conversation with somebody in the City of Melbourne who said, "We worked really hard not to fine you." And she said, "Oh my God, I didn't even realise you were going to fine me." But you know, these kind of simple things then start to kind of have a huge impact on what our laneways look like. And I would recommend you all go to Guildford Lane if you haven't. It's beautiful.
So we've got about 10 more minutes left, and I've got a heap of questions here, but I also think maybe you might have some questions as well. So I'm going to see whether you do, and if you do, we're going to run to you, otherwise I'm going to keep going. I think there's a question over there.
Hi, my name's Catherine. I concur that it's temporal and spatial, but the bit that's missing is inclusion. Human beings make cities. And I think that we have to turn our mind to, you know, each of the questions or each of the conversations have skirted around that as an assumption. I believe we've actually got to bring that up front and centre. And Martine made the comment that you actually need to bring the non-usual suspects into conversation. And I think that's the bit that I'm hearing sort of skirted around. I'd like your views in terms of how important the inclusion, so that we don't have the western suburbs being marginalised and the inner 5Ks being privileged.
Thank you, thank you. Martine, do you want to speculate on how the City of Melbourne could maybe be more inclusive? What would be the kind of things that would make people who live all around Melbourne feel more inclined to say, let's jump on a train, or let's get into the city and spend some money and have some time in the city and be part of the city and feel that it's their city in that sense of inclusiveness?
Well, there are things you can do on the planning front that I'll leave to Rob and others to talk about. But there is the question of better connectivity between making it easier for people to come into the city, providing incentives for them to come, including things like flexible pricing on public transport. And providing also greater amenity here. But I think it's not just about bringing people back here, which is very important, and providing, and I think the city's done a really good job in making it a very welcoming place, including, activities in the street that you don't actually have to pay for. And then there's also our museums and other places that can be visited. So we have a lot of very attractive things for people to come to, but making that kind of connection and getting back and forth and building better connections, and I think Rob's absolutely right. We've got to stop expanding. We've got to improve what we've got, improve connectivity, make it easier and cheaper for people to come back and forth and enjoy the amenity, but also to continue to build on what has clearly been a suburban revival. I mean, there are local industries in local suburbs now that have done really well under COVID, and keeping that supported and going is another another thing that I think also the councils can work very hard on encouraging and building.
Marcus, did you have something to add?
Yeah, look, just on the inclusion notion, there's a little bit too much talk of dictatorship tonight. But when I think of, I think the inclusion question should take us to the question of rejuvenating or regenerating democracy at the metropolitan level, so that the city is governed by the people of metropolitan Melbourne, which it kind of was during the Melbourne Metropolitan Board of Works days, by the way, because the Board of Works was accountable to a forum that included elected councillors from right across the metropolitan area. So people felt as if they had a say in their city. But I also wanted to say on the inclusion question that the fellow at the other end of this panel here has had a lot to do with creating a city, or enabling us to create a city that is inclusive in many respects. The deliberate emphasis for many years, close to 40 years, on creating a public realm where people are welcome, the clustering of community and civic facilities, the clustering of sports facilities, really means that Melbourne is loved by people right across the metropolitan area. We just need to give them a say in how it's managed going forward.
The word I'd use, if you're going to talk about inclusivity, and Martine used it, is access. People need to be able to access what they want to get to. And Marcus is right, I think you've got to do it at that political level, but then you've got to do it at the personal level. And I was having a cup of coffee with Brendan Nottle last night, and just reflecting on what's happened through COVID with the homeless people. So the moment we go into COVID, every person that was on the street got a hotel room. And they got it centrally. And I started to hear stories of people who were turning their lives around. A lady who was an artist who suddenly recaptured that creativity and started to work and was assisted in that. The moment we come out of COVID, we start putting people in boarding houses out at Berwick, and you just think, have we learned anything about access that people who are homeless need to certain facilities that might be better located centrally than further out? So I think if you need to stop and look at every segment. And I've got a good friend who is actually in Toronto, Gil Penaloza, and he talks about a city that is 8 to 80. And what he says, if you design a city that's accessible for 8-year-olds and 80-year-olds, it'll be accessible for most other people. And I think that's when you start, get to inclusivity.
Yeah.
And I think recovering the community is a big part of that.
Tony, did you have anything to add to that before I get another question?
I was just going to say, I'm really liking the Metropolitan Board of Works reinvigoration, because I think it's quite interesting. So we got a new local government act last year. The state government implemented a new local government act, and within that act there is a requirement for meaningful community consultation. And it seems to me that, as Martine was talking about, kind of the siloisation of local governments, or just the siloisation of things in general, that it would be a really powerful thing to think about that in terms of a broader vision for like greater metropolitan Melbourne. And what that means, and how you could not only have meaningful input into your local government, but you could have meaningful input at a broader range and a broader spectrum. And so I think the wording is quite loosely held in the Act. So I think it will be really interesting to think about what it might mean as we move forward.
Do we have another question over there? I think we'll take this question and one other, and then we'll wrap it up.
Sorry, I'll just usurp your question. Michael Trudgeon. The question I have is essentially economic. So, having grown up in Melbourne through, in fact, the transformation that the panel have talked about since 1983, one of the things that we've seen, and to Rob's point about accessibility, and I think all the panel members talking about the notion that really what transformed Melbourne was activity. You know, we're an experience city, not a sightseeing city. And that experience and that activity was possible through access, because Melbourne was at that time a donut city with very inexpensive. So to Marcus's point around property values and the economics, and a city in effect can become a victim of its own success, where the property values go up enormously on the basis, in Melbourne's case, of an extraordinary experience that people have in the city. So my question is, are we, and this I guess goes to the point that Martine raised even about this idea of vision, and notwithstanding in fact the City Council's real interest in trying to make Melbourne a people's city rather than a car city. As our land values have gone up, what are the economic instruments we can bring to bear to allow for, in now a much more successful city, this diversity to occur in a way which could allow for the creative community that I think has been touched on and talked about, and a diverse and inclusive city? What are the ways we can try to build windows, experiments, small-scale experiments possibly, to think about how we can get that kind of diversity back in when you're talking about land values that have accelerated to the point where only lawyers and large international developers can actually buy or use land?
Thanks, Michael. It definitely goes to a very common question around how you manage the gentrification of an area so you don't strangle the very thing that made the area special in the first place. But we want answers. Marcus, I know that you're not a dictator, but nevertheless, imagine you could actually impose an answer. What would it be?
I do have an answer, and the question really resonates with me. I grew up in North Carlton, son of Italian migrants, and I saw the suburb go from a working class migrant community to, you know, one of the most expensive places on the globe to buy into, which breaks my heart. And I've seen it. My younger brother calls it urban bleaching happen in the place, and he's not a planner. But you know, some of the simple things. Well, we need to have, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we need to have a systematic way of sharing that uplift in land value. It's a crime that it's 100% privately captured. Now, if we're not prepared to bring in a tax to grab at least 50% of it, we should have mandatory inclusionary zoning for social housing. And indeed, we should have mandatory provisions for other things like affordable workspaces for creatives and even to maintain an appropriate balance of shops in a local activity centre, so it has the capacity to do the kind of things that Rob's talking about. So you can do a lot via planning if you have the guts.
Okay, well that's two good ones. Capturing value uplift and inclusionary zoning. Any other thoughts around key ways of avoiding the traps of gentrification?
Can I just add my voice to what Mark said about particularly where we were going there was affordable housing. So there is actually right now a plan for looking at affordable housing, and there's a whole range of incentives, not only through zoning and planning, but also through tax concessions, including getting more investors, big investors, to invest in things like build to rent. So there is actually a suite of options that we could explore, and the Committee for Melbourne is actually putting in a submission to the Victorian Government on affordable housing, which looks at
special provisions for key workers, and other types of, and social housing zoning, and even maybe a levy that could be used to fund, provided doesn't go back into consolidated revenue, but actually goes into paying for affordable housing. There's a suite of really good ideas around how we can build inclusivity. It's bringing them together and developing, once again, a plan that is logical and that has all agencies of government involved to support it. I'll finish with one tiny little idea about public amenity. And this is, I don't know why no one's picked this up, but speaking of the 80-year-olds and the 8-year-olds, so a number of women who have grandchildren have said to me, why doesn't the Committee for Melbourne advocate for a very simple proposition? Why don't you advocate for the extension of museum and library hours so that when we take care of our grandkids when they leave school, we're not rushing around the museum for the last half hour or being told that it's going to close? This is a really simple, brilliant idea. In Europe and in many other countries, they have their museum hours till 7 p.m, which is a way that you open up your amenity. A lot of it's going to be free of charge. You are going to probably have to pay maybe an additional wage or two, but hey, what a great idea to provide people with employment. So that's an idea I'd like to leave you.
Very good, very good.
One.
We're moving from the macro to the micro. I love it, I love it. Look, we really want one last question. I think we had your hand up there. I hope it's nice and sharp and pointed.
All right. Thank you all. Thank you all. It's been a great discussion. And I like the opening reflection on Melbourne, and it reminded me of it as a city of villages. And I think the way Rob described it. And then I'm just wondering, to ask a slightly provocative question, is how, when we're planning out Fisherman's Bend, the Dinan precinct, the Arden precinct, and we've got the speculation that is clearly a major component in those, how the COVID experience might allow us to reflect on that and to start to think about what the legacy of Melbourne has, and whether that can go towards a recentering of those precincts into something that's much more about the communities that are going to live in them or work in them or be educated in them. So it's thinking about whether this is a paradigm shift in the thinking of those large precincts, and whether we can reset some of the visions in some of those large areas, because there is an opportunity there that I always look at those structure planning documents and I really wonder whether we're really capturing the most of those areas.
Man, that's a big question. So I'm going to see which of our talented speakers can most poignantly give us a response to that.
I'm happy to talk a bit to... I absolutely agree with you. There should be places that we reset. Unfortunately, as Marcus and others have mentioned, Fisherman's Bend got away from us when a planning minister basically said they were going to convert it to a different sort of area without putting in place the value capture that you needed to give it the infrastructure that would have made it a better place. And you can see Arden going the same way. Arden is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, basically because people are saying, how much money can we get out of Arden to pay for the overrun that we've got on Metro? So we need a new set of values. And, you know, cities are very simple things. I mean, if you get a reasonable density and mixed use and good connectivity and high quality public realm and all those things, you get a good city. And if we measure the value you get out of it, we're doing a development at the moment up in Theory Street. And we paid 86 million for the site. And everybody said, you've paid too much. But let me tell you what the finances look like. We paid 86, we invested 70 million in community facilities. We sold half of the site above a car park that we're creating for Queen Victoria Market, which has got 500 cars in, to a developer. And we got back about 27 million from that. We had a residual value that was worth something like 27 million. We then got a new park, which is going to be the surface car park by Queen Victoria Market. That's worth 180 million. And suddenly, this looks like a very good scheme. But it's because the community value, as Marcus said, was built into that formula. And until we start building that in, and we don't let that uplift go, you know, to someone who's made no effort at all, they've just had a planning scheme change in front of them, we will never get those places you're talking about, because everybody will The land value goes up and then the next person wants to up it and they push it a bit further. And what you get is, whatever's selling the most at the time that it's happening, rather than a rounded community and a rounded piece of city.
Thanks, Rob. Did you have one last comment to say?
I just wanted to say on that, I think that during COVID we've realised that our public spaces have never been more important to us, and I would consider this a public space as well. So public spaces are not only our parks and gardens, but they're our public programming. They're any way that the public connects in public space, in our community. And you can see that we need to think about how there's lots and lots of different kinds of public spaces that we can have. Museums are one, the Botanic Gardens is another. This is a different form yet again. And we need to actually think about how these spaces get governed and how events play out in them to really actually maximise their value to the community. And so public programming is really important in that. Longer opening hours is really important in terms of accessibility for some of our museums. And I think it's really a moment when we think about the fact that pre-COVID Melbourne, like the growth rate of Melbourne was kind of astronomical. And we know that there's not a huge amount of public open space, if we don't think about our streets and our pavements, in the CBD itself. And, a lot of councils are coming up against this issue. And so to really think about how we start to deliver really, really good quality public spaces of all different varieties across Greater Metropolitan Melbourne is a really, really important thing to think about.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think we're going to call a close at that. If it's possible to tie this together in any kind of way at all, I would say that what everyone is saying in different forms is that what we need is connected thinking. What we can see is that the solutions that we're looking at, it involves everything from taxation to planning to transport to spatial considerations to social considerations to community. We need joined up dots and maybe some form of authority, some sort of a commission, some kind of body that can actually has the capacity to bring these disparate things together is what we need. We need big thinking. But we'll leave it at that for the moment. I'd like to thank Rob, Martine, Tanya, and Marcus. But before we finish, since we've been talking about occupying public space and making programming and being a part of this whole thing, this is the last talk for the series here. I would like to have a special thanks for the MPavilion and for all our speakers here today. And thank you for coming.